Michel Foucault. Paul-Michel Foucault, generally known as Michel Foucault, was a French philosopher, historian of ideas, social theorist, and literary critic. Foucault's theories primarily address the relationship between power and knowledge, and how they are used as a form of social control through societal institutions. Though often cited as a post-structuralist and postmodernist, Foucault rejected these labels, preferring to present his thought as a critical history of modernity. His thought has influenced academics, especially those working in communication studies, sociology, cultural studies, literary theory, feminism, and critical theory. Activist groups have also found his theories compelling. Born in Poitiers, France, into an upper-middle-class family, Foucault was educated at the Lycée Henri IV, at the École Normale Supérieure, where he developed an interest in philosophy and came under the influence of his tutors Jean Hippolyte and Louis Althusser, and at the University of Paris, where he earned degrees in philosophy and psychology. After several years as a cultural diplomat abroad, he returned to France and published his first major book, The History of Madness. After obtaining work between 1960 and 1966 at the University of Clermont-Ferrand, he produced The Birth of the Clinic and The Order of Things, publications which displayed his increasing involvement with structuralism, from which he later distanced himself. These first three histories exemplified a historiographical technique Foucault was developing called archaeology. From 1966 to 1968, Foucault lectured at the University of Tunis before returning to France, where he became head of the philosophy department at the new experimental University of Paris 8. Foucault subsequently published The Archaeology of Knowledge. In 1970, Foucault was admitted to the Collège de France, a membership he retained until his death. He also became active in a number of left-wing groups involved in campaigns against racism and human rights abuses and for penal reform. Foucault later published Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, in which he developed archaeological and genealogical methods which emphasized the role that power plays in society. Foucault died in Paris of neurological problems compounded by HIV/AIDS. He became the first public figure in France to die from the disease. His partner Daniel Defert founded the AIDS charity in his memory. Paul-Michel Foucault was born on October 15, 1926 in the city of Poitiers, west-central France, as the second of three children in a prosperous and socially conservative upper-middle-class family. Family tradition prescribed naming him after his father, Paul Foucault, but his mother insisted on the addition of Michel, referred to as Paul at school. He expressed a preference for Michel throughout his life. His father, a successful local surgeon born in Fontainebleau, moved to Poitiers, where he set up his own practice and married local woman Anne Malapert. She was the daughter of prosperous surgeon Dr. Prosper Malapert, who owned a private practice and taught anatomy at the University of Poitiers School of Medicine. Paul Foucault eventually took over his father-in-law's medical practice, while his wife took charge of their large mid-19th century house, Le Piroyer, in the village of Vendouvre-du-Poitou. Together the couple had three children, a girl named Francine and two boys, Paul-Michel and Denis, who all shared the same fair hair and bright blue eyes. The children were raised to be nominal Roman Catholics, attending Mass at the Church of Saint Porcher, and while Michel briefly became an altar boy, none of the family were devout. In later life, Foucault would reveal very little about his childhood. Describing himself as a juvenile delinquent, he claimed his father was a bully who would sternly punish him. In 1930 Foucault began his schooling, 2 years early, at the local Lycée Henri IV. Here he undertook 2 years of elementary education before entering the main lycée, where he stayed until 1936. He then undertook his first 4 years of secondary education at the same establishment, excelling in French, Greek, Latin and history but doing poorly at arithmetic and mathematics. In 1939 the Second World War broke out and in 1940 Nazi Germany occupied France. Foucault's parents opposed the occupation and the Vichy regime, but did not join the resistance. In 1940 Foucault's mother enrolled him in the College Saint Stanislas, a strict Roman Catholic institution run by the Jesuits. Lonely, he described his years there as an ordeal, but he excelled academically, particularly in philosophy, history, and literature. In 1942 he entered his final year, the Terminale, where he focused on the study of philosophy, earning his baccalaureate in 1943. Returning to the local Lycée Henry IV, he studied history and philosophy for a year, aided by a personal tutor, the philosopher Louis Girard. Rejecting his father's wishes that he become a surgeon, in 1945 Foucault went to Paris, where he enrolled in one of the country's most prestigious secondary schools, which was also known as the Lycée Henri IV. Here he studied under the philosopher Jean Hippolyte, an existentialist and expert on the work of 19th-century German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hippolyte had devoted himself to uniting existentialist theories with the dialectical theories of Hegel and Karl Marx. These ideas influenced Foucault, who adopted Hippolyte's conviction that philosophy must develop through a study of history. Attaining excellent results, in autumn 1946 Foucault was admitted to the elite École Normale Supérieure. To gain entry, he undertook exams and an oral interrogation by Georges Canguilhem and Pierre-Maxime Scull. Of the 100 students entering the ENS, Foucault ranked fourth based on his entry results, and encountered the highly competitive nature of the institution. Like most of his classmates, he lived in the school's communal dormitories on the Parisian Rue d'Ulm. He remained largely unpopular, spending much time alone, reading voraciously. His fellow students noted his love of violence and the macabre. He decorated his bedroom with images of torture and war drawn during the Napoleonic Wars by Spanish artist Francisco Goya, and on one occasion chased a classmate with a dagger. Prone to self-harm, in 1948 Foucault allegedly attempted suicide. His father sent him to see the psychiatrist Jean Delay at the Sainte Anne Hospital Center. Obsessed with the idea of self-mutilation and suicide, Foucault attempted the latter several times in ensuing years, praising suicide in later writings. The ENS's doctor examined Foucault's state of mind, suggesting that his suicidal tendencies emerged from the distress surrounding his homosexuality, because same-sex sexual activity was socially taboo in France. At the time, Foucault engaged in homosexual activity with men whom he encountered in the underground Parisian gay scene, also indulging in drug use. According to biographer James Miller, he enjoyed the thrill and sense of danger that these activities offered him. Although studying various subjects, Foucault soon gravitated towards philosophy, reading not only Hegel and Marx but also Immanuel Kant, Edmund Husserl, and most significantly, Martin Heidegger. He began reading the publications of philosopher Gaston Bachelard, taking a particular interest in his work exploring the history of science. He graduated from the ENS with a day in philosophy in 1949. His day thesis under the direction of Hippolyte was titled La Constitution d'un transcendental dans la phénoménologie de l'esprit de Hegel. In 1948, the philosopher Louis Althusser became a tutor at the ENS. A Marxist, he influenced both Foucault and a number of other students, encouraging them to join the French Communist Party. Foucault did so in 1950, but never became particularly active in its activities, and never adopted an orthodox Marxist viewpoint, refuting core Marxist tenets such as class struggle. He soon became dissatisfied with the bigotry that he experienced within the party's ranks. He personally faced homophobia and was appalled by the anti-Semitism exhibited during the 1952–1953 Doctors' Plot in the Soviet Union. He left the Communist Party in 1953, but remained Althusser's friend and defender for the rest of his life. Although failing at the first attempt in 1950, he passed his aggregation in philosophy on the second try, in 1951. Excused from national service on medical grounds, he decided to start a doctorate at the Fondation Thiers in 1951, focusing on the philosophy of psychology, but he relinquished it after only 1 year in 1952. Foucault was also interested in psychology and he attended Daniel Lagacé's lectures at the University of Paris, where he obtained a BA in psychology in 1949 and a diploma in psychopathology from the university's Institute of Psychology in June 1952. Over the following few years, Foucault embarked on a variety of research and teaching jobs. From 1951 to 1955, he worked as a psychology instructor at the ENS at Althusser's invitation. In Paris, he shared a flat with his brother, who was training to become a surgeon, but for 3 days in the week commuted to the northern town of Lille, teaching psychology at the Université de Lille from 1953 to 1954. Many of his students liked his lecturing style. Meanwhile, he continued working on his thesis, visiting the Bibliothèque Nationale every day to read the work of psychologists like Ivan Pavlov, Jean Piaget, and Karl Jaspers. Undertaking research at the Psychiatric Institute of the St. Anne Hospital, he became an unofficial intern, studying the relationship between doctor and patient and aiding experiments in the electroencephalographic laboratory. Foucault adopted many of the theories of the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, undertaking psychoanalytical interpretation of his dreams and making friends undergo Rorschach tests. Embracing the Parisian avant-garde, Foucault entered into a romantic relationship with the serialist composer Jean Barak. Together, they tried to produce their greatest work, heavily used recreational drugs and engaged in sadomasochistic sexual activity. In August 1953, Foucault and Barak holidayed in Italy, where the philosopher immersed himself in untimely meditations, a set of 4 essays by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Later describing Nietzsche's work as a revelation, he felt that reading the book deeply affected him, being a watershed moment in his life. Foucault subsequently experienced another groundbreaking self-revelation when watching a Parisian performance of Samuel Beckett's new play, Waiting for Godot, in 1953. Interested in literature, Foucault was an avid reader of the philosopher Maurice Blancot's book reviews published in Nouvelle Revue Française. Enamored of Blancot's literary style and critical theories, in later works he adopted Blancot's technique of interviewing himself. Foucault also came across Hermann Broch's 1945 novel The Death of Virgil, a work that obsessed both him and Barak. While the latter attempted to convert the work into an epic opera, Foucault admired Broch's text for its portrayal of death as an affirmation of life. The couple took a mutual interest in the work of such authors as the Marquis de Sade, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Franz Kafka, and Jean Genet, all of whose works explored the themes of sex and violence. Interested in the work of Swiss psychologist Ludwig Binswanger, Foucault aided family friend Jacqueline Verdoes in translating his works into French. Foucault was particularly interested in Binswanger's studies of Ellen West who, like himself, had a deep obsession with suicide, eventually killing herself. In 1954, Foucault authored an introduction to Binswanger's paper Dream and Existence, in which he argued that dreams constituted the birth of the world or the heart laid bare, expressing the mind's deepest desires. That same year, Foucault published his first book, Mental Illness and Personality, in which he exhibited his influence from both Marxist and Heideggerian thought, covering a wide range of subject matter from the reflex psychology of Pavlov to the classic psychoanalysis of Freud. Referencing the work of sociologists and anthropologists such as Émile Durkheim and Margaret Mead, he presented his theory that illness was culturally relative. Biographer James Miller noted that while the book exhibited erudition and evident intelligence, it lacked the kind of fire and flair which Foucault exhibited in subsequent works. It was largely critically ignored, receiving only one review at the time. Foucault grew to despise it, unsuccessfully attempting to prevent its republication and translation into English. Foucault spent the next 5 years abroad, first in Sweden, working as cultural diplomat at the University of Uppsala, a job obtained through his acquaintance with historian of religion Georges Dumézil. At Uppsala he was appointed a reader in French language and literature, while simultaneously working as director of the Maison de France, thus opening the possibility of a cultural diplomatic career. Although finding it difficult to adjust to the Nordic gloom and long winters, he developed close friendships with 2 Frenchmen, biochemist Jean-François Miguel and physicist Jacques Papet-Lapini, and entered into romantic and sexual relationships with various men. In Uppsala, he became known for his heavy alcohol consumption and reckless driving in his new Jaguar car. In spring 1956, Barak broke from his relationship with Foucault, announcing that he wanted to leave the vertigo of madness. In Uppsala, Foucault spent much of his spare time in the university's Carolina Rediviva library, making use of their Bibliotheca Walraiana collection of texts on the history of medicine for his ongoing research. Finishing his doctoral thesis, Foucault hoped it would be accepted by Uppsala University, but Sten Lindroth, a positivistic historian of science there, was unimpressed, asserting that it was full of speculative generalizations and was a poor work of history. He refused to allow Foucault to be awarded a doctorate at Uppsala. In part because of this rejection, Foucault left Sweden. Later, Foucault admitted that the work was a first draft with certain lack of quality. Again at Dumazil's recognition, in October 1958 Foucault arrived in the Polish capital, Warsaw, placed in charge of the University of Warsaw's Centre Français. Foucault found life in Poland difficult due to the lack of material goods and services following the destruction of the Second World War. Witnessing the aftermath of the Polish October, in which students had protested against the governing Communist Polish United Workers' Party, he felt that most Poles despised their government as a puppet regime of the Soviet Union, and thought that the system ran badly. Considering the university a liberal enclave, he traveled the country giving lectures. Proving popular, he adopted the position of de facto cultural attaché. As in France and Sweden, homosexual activity was legal but socially frowned upon in Poland, and he undertook relationships with a number of men. One was a Polish security agent who hoped to trap Foucault in an embarrassing situation, which would therefore reflect badly on the French embassy. Racked in diplomatic scandal, he was ordered to leave Poland for a new destination. Various positions were available in West Germany, and so Foucault relocated to the Institut Français Hamburg, teaching the same courses he had given in Uppsala and Warsaw. Spending much time in the Reeperbahn red light district, he entered into a relationship with a transvestite. In West Germany, Foucault completed in 1960 his primary thesis for his state doctorate, entitled Folie et de raison, Histoire de la folie à l'âge classique, a philosophical work based upon his studies into the history of medicine. The book discussed how West European society had dealt with madness, arguing that it was a social construct distinct from mental illness. Foucault traces the evolution of the concept of madness through three phases: the Renaissance, the later 17th and 18th centuries, and the modern experience. The work alludes to the work of French poet and playwright Antonin Artaud, who exerted a strong influence over Foucault's thought at the time. Histoire de la folie was an expansive work, consisting of 943 pages of text, followed by appendices and a bibliography. Foucault submitted it at the University of Paris, although the university's regulations for awarding a state doctorate required the submission of both his main thesis and a shorter complementary thesis. Obtaining a doctorate in France at the period was a multi-step process. The first step was to obtain a rapporteur, or sponsor for the work. Foucault chose Georges Canguilhem. The second was to find a publisher, and as a result Folie et de raison would be published in French in May 1961 by the Compagnie Plon, whom Foucault chose over Presses Universitaires de France after being rejected by Gallimard. In 1964, a heavily abridged version was published as a mass-market paperback, then translated into English for publication the following year as Madness and Civilization. Folie et de raison received a mixed reception in France and in foreign journals focusing on French affairs. Although it was critically acclaimed by Maurice Blancot, Michel Serres, Roland Barthes, Gaston Bachelard, and Fernand Braudel, it was largely ignored by the leftist press, much to Foucault's disappointment. It was notably criticized for advocating metaphysics by young philosopher Jacques Derrida in a March 1963 lecture at the University of Paris. Responding with a vicious retort, Foucault criticized Derrida's interpretation of René Descartes. The two remained bitter rivals until reconciling in 1981. In the English-speaking world, the work became a significant influence on the anti-psychiatry movement during the 1960s. Foucault took a mixed approach to this, associating with a number of anti-psychiatrists but arguing that most of them misunderstood his work. Foucault's secondary thesis was a translation and commentary on German philosopher Immanuel Kant's 1798 work Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View. Largely consisting of Foucault's discussion of textual dating and archaeology of the Kantian text, he rounded off the thesis with an evocation of Nietzsche, his biggest philosophical influence. This work's rapporteur was his old tutor and then director of the ENS, Hippolyte, who was well acquainted with German philosophy. After both theses were championed and reviewed, he underwent his public defense, the Soutenance de these, on May 20, 1961. The academics responsible for reviewing his work were concerned about the unconventional nature of his major thesis. Reviewer Henri Gouhier noted that it was not a conventional work of history, making sweeping generalizations without sufficient particular argument, and that Foucault clearly thinks in allegories. They all agreed, however, that the overall project was of merit, awarding Foucault his doctorate despite reservations. In October 1960, Foucault took a tenured post in philosophy at the University of Clermont-Ferrand, commuting to the city every week from Paris, where he lived in a high-rise block on the Rue du Docteur Finlay. Responsible for teaching psychology, which was subsumed within the philosophy department, he was considered a fascinating but rather traditional teacher at Clermont. The department was run by Jules Vuillemin, who soon developed a friendship with Foucault. Foucault then took Vuillemin's job when the latter was elected to the Collège de France in 1962. In this position, Foucault took a dislike to another staff member whom he considered stupid, Roger Garaudy, a senior figure in the Communist Party. Foucault made life at the university difficult for Garaudy, leading the latter to transfer to Poitiers. Foucault also caused controversy by securing a university job for his lover, the philosopher Daniel Defert, with whom he retained a non-monogamous relationship for the rest of his life. Foucault maintained a keen interest in literature, publishing reviews in amongst others the literary journals Tel Quel and Nouvelle Revue Française, and sitting on the editorial board of Critique. In May 1963, he published a book devoted to poet, novelist, and playwright Raymond Roussel. It was written in under 2 months, published by Gallimard, and would be described by biographer David Macy as a very personal book that resulted from a love affair with Russell's work. It would be published in English in 1983 as Death and the Labyrinth, The World of Raymond Roussel. Receiving few reviews, it was largely ignored. That same year he published a sequel to Folie et de raison, entitled Naissance de la Clinique, subsequently translated as The Birth of the Clinic, an archaeology of medical perception. Shorter than its predecessor, it focused on the changes that the medical establishment underwent in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Like his preceding work, Naissance de la Clinique was largely critically ignored, but later gained a cult following. It was of interest within the field of medical ethics, as it considered the ways in which the history of medicine and hospitals, and the training that those working within them receive, bring about a particular way of looking at the body, the medical gaze. Foucault was also selected to be among the 18-man commission that assembled between November 1963 and March 1964 to discuss university reforms that were to be implemented by Christian Fouchet, the Gaullist Minister of National Education. Implemented in 1967, they brought staff strikes and student protests. In April 1966, Gallimard published Foucault's Les mots et les choses, later translated as The Order of Things, an archaeology of the human sciences. Exploring how man came to be an object of knowledge, it argued that all periods of history have possessed certain underlying conditions of truth that constituted what was acceptable as scientific discourse. Foucault argues that these conditions of discourse have changed over time, from one period's episteme to another. Although designed for a specialist audience, the work gained media attention, becoming a surprise bestseller in France. Appearing at the height of interest in structuralism, Foucault was quickly grouped with scholars Jacques Lacan, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and Roland Barthes, as the latest wave of thinkers set to topple the existentialism popularized by Jean-Paul Sartre. Although initially accepting this description, Foucault soon vehemently rejected it. Foucault and Sartre regularly criticized one another in the press. Both Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir attacked Foucault's ideas as bourgeois, while Foucault retaliated against their Marxist beliefs by proclaiming that Marxism exists in 19th-century thought as a fish exists in water, that is, it ceases to breathe anywhere else. In September 1966, Foucault took a position teaching psychology at the University of Tunis in Tunisia. His decision to do so was largely because his lover, Doctorate, had been posted to the country as part of his national service. Foucault moved a few kilometers from Tunis, to the village of Sidi Bou Said, where fellow academic Gérard Delis-Dalle lived with his wife. Soon after his arrival, Foucault announced that Tunisia was blessed by history, a nation which deserves to live forever because it was where Hannibal and Saint Augustine lived. His lectures at the university proved very popular, and were well attended. Although many young students were enthusiastic about his teaching, they were critical of what they believed to be his right-wing political views, viewing him as a representative of Gaullist technocracy, even though he considered himself a leftist. Foucault was in Tunis during the anti-government and pro-Palestinian riots that rocked the city in June 1967, and which continued for a year. Although highly critical of the violent, ultranationalistic, and anti-Semitic nature of many protesters, he used his status to try to prevent some of his militant leftist students from being arrested and tortured for their role in the agitation. He hid their printing press in his garden, and tried to testify on their behalf at their trials, but was prevented when the trials became closed-door events. While in Tunis, Foucault continued to write. Inspired by a correspondence with the surrealist artist René Magritte, Foucault started to write a book about the Impressionist artist Édouard Manet, but never completed it. In 1968, Foucault returned to Paris, moving into an apartment on the Rue de Vaugirard. After the May 1968 student protests, Minister of Education Edgar Faure responded by founding new universities with greater autonomy. Most prominent of these was the Centre Expérimental de Vincennes in Vincennes on the outskirts of Paris. A group of prominent academics were asked to select teachers to run the centre's departments, and Ken Gilham recommended Foucault as head of the philosophy department. Becoming a tenured professor of Vincennes, Foucault's desire was to obtain the best in French philosophy today for his department, employing Michel Serres, Judith Miller, Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, François Regnault, Henri Weber, Étienne Balibar, and François Châtelet. Most of them were Marxists or ultra-left activists. Lectures began at the university in January 1969, and straight away its students and staff, including Foucault, were involved in occupations and clashes with police, resulting in arrests. In February, Foucault gave a speech denouncing police provocation to protesters at the Latin Quarter of the Mutualite. Such actions marked Foucault's embrace of the ultra-left, undoubtedly influenced by Doctorate, who had gained a job at Vincennes' sociology department and who had become a Maoist. Most of the courses at Foucault's philosophy department were Marxist-Leninist oriented, although Foucault himself gave courses on Nietzsche, the end of metaphysics, and the discourse of sexuality, which were highly popular and oversubscribed. While the right-wing press was heavily critical of this new institution, new Minister of Education Olivier Guichard was angered by its ideological bent and the lack of exams, with students being awarded degrees in a haphazard manner. He refused national accreditation of the department's degrees, resulting in a public rebuttal from Foucault. Foucault desired to leave Vincennes and become a fellow of the prestigious Collège de France. He requested to join, taking up a chair in what he called the History of Systems of Thought, and his request was championed by members Dumézil, Hippolyte, and Vuillemin. In November 1969, when an opening became available, Foucault was elected to the college, though with opposition by a large minority. He gave his inaugural lecture in December 1970, which was subsequently published as L'Ordre du Discours. He was obliged to give 12 weekly lectures a year and did so for the rest of his life, covering the topics that he was researching at the time. These became one of the events of Parisian intellectual life and were repeatedly packed out events. On Mondays, he also gave seminars to a group of students. Many of them became a Foucauldian tribe who worked with him on his research. He enjoyed this teamwork and collective research, and together they would publish a number of short books. Working at the college allowed him to travel widely, giving lectures in Brazil, Japan, Canada, and the United States over the next 14 years. In 1970 and 1972, Foucault served as a professor in the French department of the University at Buffalo in Buffalo, New York. In May 1971, Foucault founded the group d'Information sur les prisons along with historian Pierre Vidal-Naquet and journalist Jean-Marie Domnac. The GIP aimed to investigate and expose poor conditions in prisons and give prisoners and ex-prisoners a voice in French society. It was highly critical of the penal system, believing that it converted petty criminals into hardened delinquents. The GIP gave press conferences and staged protests surrounding the events of the Toul prison riot in December 1971, alongside other prison riots that it sparked off. In doing so, it faced a police crackdown and repeated arrests. The group became active across France, with 2,000 to 3,000 members, but disbanded before 1974. Also campaigning against the death penalty, Foucault authored a short book on the case of the convicted murderer Pierre Rivière. After his research into the penal system, Foucault published Surveiller et punir, Naissance de la prison in 1975, offering a history of the system in Western Europe. In it, Foucault examines the penal evolution away from corporal and capital punishment to the penitentiary system that began in Europe and the United States around the end of the 18th century. Biographer Didier Eribon described it as perhaps the finest of Foucault's works, and it was well received. Foucault was also active in anti-racist campaigns. In November 1971, he was a leading figure in protests following the perceived racist killing of Arab migrant Djelali Ben Ali. In this he worked alongside his old rival Sartre, the journalist Claude Mauriac, and one of his literary heroes, Jean Genet. This campaign was formalized as the Committee for the Defense of the Rights of Immigrants, but there was tension at their meetings as Foucault opposed the anti-Israeli sentiment of many Arab workers and Maoist activists. At a December 1972 protest against the police killing of